The origins of the world's first banking oligarchy. The video will be a brief study on how the world's first elite banking companies like the Peruzzi Company rose to power and amassed significant wealth at the expense of the rest of European society, and a short outline of the resulting financial crash. The sources used for this video is included in the description. At one time in history, Venice was the center of global trade and finance. Their naval technology and geographic location on the main trade routes meant that Venice had a strong competitive advantage. Theirs was mainly a money-lending economy due to the lack of land for agriculture. This is where the future of banking would develop. It was the center of financial and trading power, and consisted of a few oligarchic banking families based mainly in North Italy, like Venice and Florence. In a port city and trading hub like Venice, the role of a money changer was crucial. Huge varieties of different currencies would require exchanging to facilitate international trade. The role of these money changers were the predecessors to modern banking. Large banking families like the Peruzzi Company would have started off providing money changing services. Banks and pawnshops were a place where people kept things for safekeeping, and a distinction began to emerge between fungible and non-fungible items deposited. Items deposited for safekeeping were fungible, which meant that you were entitled to get the exact same item back. However, items like coins were non-fungible. You only needed the same value back, not the exact same coins you deposited. This implied that the banks could use the money deposited in their accounts, since they didn't have the obligation to return the exact same coins, only the value represented by the coins. From this developed the notion that banks were not just a place to deposit things for safekeeping, but began to operate as an intermediary for transactions between people, using banknotes and extinguishing debts between people. In addition, the invention of double-entry bookkeeping meant that people didn't actually need to physically transfer coins. Transfers could be done through oral agreement, and the banks could make adjustments to the accounts. So, by mid-1300s, a well-developed system of transfer banking was in operation, and the Peruzzi were key members of the Guild of Money Changers. As the population in Europe grew, and the need for grain increased, Florence had to import most of its grain to maintain its commercial enterprises. The Peruzzi Company took steps to obtain power over the areas rich in grain production, mainly the south of Italy. They supported rulers that would benefit their objectives of slowly gaining control of the area, like King Charles I of Anjou, as King of Sicily and Naples, and later his son, King Charles II. Foreign merchants were favored by the king because it was easier to force them out of the country if they became too powerful. In contrast, it was harder to expel local merchants when they posed a threat to his power. So it was mutually advantageous for the king to form an alliance with foreign merchants, like the Peruzzi Company. Initially, the first king held tight control over the grain, only giving licenses for exporting and imposing taxes and duties. The king used secret agents to keep an eye on the prices of grain in the importing countries, and set the prices. However, later on, due to the costs of war, his son King Charles II ended up giving much more power to the Peruzzi Company bankers in exchange for funds. The company eventually had a monopoly over the grain market. The English monarchy was at first reluctant to use the bankers for financing, but by King Edward III, the royal government gave in. An interesting question is, why did they need to borrow money from them in the first place? Couldn't they simply issue their own currency as they were the ruling monarchy? This might be investigated in another future video. So, basically the bankers gained lucrative monopolies in commodities and other favors which greatly increased their profitability, in exchange for lending money to the ruling royal governments. For example, they financed King Charles II's purchase of a port in Morea, or southern Greece. In return, they were allowed to promptly set up a branch there. The king also allowed them to set up a bank in Naples. He also gave them the power to control the taxation of grain exports. In exchange for loans, King Robert of Naples allowed the bankers to monopolize the export trade and manage much of his own administration, such as controlling the mint, collecting taxes, appointing officials, and running the army. In the early to mid-1300s, the Peruzzi formed a syndicate with the Bardi and Accioli families, whom were the other large banking oligopolies. They all had similar practices of privatizing royal revenues. The Bardi family are known to have financed Christopher Columbus's voyage to America. According to the French economic historian, Yves Georges, the Adriatic Sea was plowed by Venetian ships, loaded by Florentine merchants, who transported to Venetian possessions, and even to Venice itself, grains bought from growers or royal estates, as well as oil, wine, cheese, and other agricultural products. They would persuade the king to go to war, against the grain-producing areas they did not control. For example, Sicilian grain producers allied to the Holy Roman Empire, which were their rivals, were reduced by war under the influence of the Peruzzi banks. Through the years, providing finance for the various military activities also gained them much prestige, protection and commercial opportunities. For example, the financing of the conquests of Rhodes, by the Knights Hospitallers, the military arm of the Catholic Church, led to the setting up of a branch there. It was a useful market in itself, as well as a transit point for trade in the Levant and Asia Minor. The establishment of a branch in Cyprus also allowed them close proximity to obtain a vast array of other goods such as wool, cotton, silk, cloths, rope, precious metals, jewelry, and spices. Their branch in France sold merchandise from the Mediterranean and the Levant. This also included the selling of credit and financing for the purchase of the goods. They had a branch in Belgium from which they provided credit for buyers and sellers of wool, in the luxury cloth trade. They also supplied the financing in ships, for the papacy's Holy Crusades, thus furthering their reach and control. To increase their income flow from King Edward, they increased the price of wool by orchestrating a wool boycott, which contributed to destroying the textile industry of Flanders. They also overvalued their currency, which meant that King Edward had to pay more for his debts. The banks could do this, because silver and gold was centralized in Venice, so they could control the exchange rates as they controlled the reserves in the mints. In order to reclaim control, King Edward issued his own new currency, the English florin. However, the Florentine bankers essentially controlled the merchants, and forced them to reject his currency as payment. He eventually defaulted on his debts. The Flemish cloth makers were significant participants at the Champagne fairs of France, which was a hub for artists and skilled merchants to trade in their wares, including not only textiles, but ironwork, woodwork, wool and food etc. The Venetian and Florentine bankers ultimately took over these fairs with large amounts of credit, bank branches, and with luxury goods, from the East, according to Gallagher. The rate of return expected by the Florentine and Venetian bankers far exceeded that of the physical production of the European economy, which was in decline by the time the bankers were taking over the various industries, not only the textiles industries. The large family banks, their powerful partners, and the landed aristocracy of northern Italy did not have to pay direct taxes. They financed rulers in the form of providing loans. These loans were consolidated into a fund which they expected a return on, in the form of interest and sometimes principal. However, the interest on the loans were collected from the indirect taxes which primarily the poorer classes had to pay, like taxes on salt, etc. The banks and landed aristocracy, who provided these loans, considered the loans to be perpetual, since the capital continued to grow, and was never paid off for centuries. Large amounts of public lands would become security for these loans. As the loans were not paid back, they would simply recoup their returns from the perpetual rents that would last for centuries. Later on, private creditors themselves would finance a private debt fund. According to Machiavelli, the Italian diplomat and philosopher, a debt funded by the creditors themselves became even more powerful than the state. These debts were also reinvested in the open markets, which could be bought by foreigners and citizens. It became unpopular when investors had to sell credits at a loss, in order to have liquidity for levies. Provided Venice maintained a promise to amortize some principal, the debts were sold at high prices. When trust declined, the states had to buy back these forced loans and then, they would peak again. They also obtained vast land holdings, through lending money to landowners like farmers, who had to pay for their expenses. The banks would lend money, in exchange, the farmers or landowners would calculate the lifetime rent value of their land and would sell that value to the banks. That would obviously mean the bankers would ultimately take ownership of the land. This type of thing significantly increased the bank's rural land holdings and guaranteed the loss of land for farmers and other landowners. The Venetian bankers had a monopoly in the bullions imported to the city. They refined it into bars or coins for their clients. They also used their vast maritime empire and cutting-edge naval technology to import gold and export silver back into the East. They ultimately had control over the currency and coinage of the time, and engaged in speculative trades for profit. However, the financial looting could no longer be sustained, as their rates of profits far exceeded the actual physical reproduction of the economies of Europe. The damage to the real economy caused a decline in living standards, while money was in short supply. During the past 40 years prior to the crash, the population of Europe had stalled, and the infrastructure of the cities had decayed. Once the Black Plague hit, the population of Europe plunged even further. According to Hunt, the other factors that led to the demise of the Peruzzi Company were the dislocations in the grain trade, loss of papal business, political turmoil in Florence, troubles in France, and a decline in the company's capitalization. According to Hunt, the members of the Peruzzi family were able to keep their wealth and power even after the crash, which indicates that they had already distanced themselves from the ruins of their company. In addition, they didn't really suffer the casualty rates that others suffered during the Black Plague, probably because they had the funds to move to other regions whenever rumors of outbreaks first emerged.